Good morning. I'll explain that little passage in a minute. A quote I first found when I was about your age, when one day I was in the library at my high school. I'm not sure why I was in the library on a beautiful day. It was a beautiful day, and unlike your library, our library, which has beautiful windows you can look out, my high school library had no windows. And I know it was a beautiful day, and looking back on it, I'm not sure why I was in there, except I was probably in detention. And my school had detention in the library. And I was wandering the stacks, and I'm not making this up. I was just wandering the stacks, and a kind of dusty book, for some reason, caught my attention. There was no jacket covered on it. It was a navy blue book, a little bit of writing, and it said endurance. And I picked out the book and I started reading it. And I don't think I put it down until the next day, pretty much when I finished the book. And the quote that Mr. Goins just read is tied to that story. And as I hopefully will explain in a minute, that quote may be apocryphal. Historians are in some disagreement about whether it actually was written the way it says it was written. But as the story goes, this was an ad placed in the London Times in 1913. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Please contact Captain Ernest Shackleton for the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition to begin in 1914. Here's what we know is true. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton, who was a mariner, a captain, an explorer, had already done at least one Antarctic expedition and was planning the first Antarctic, trans-Antarctic expedition on foot. This audacious plan to bring a ship from England with 27 men and 68 sled dogs, sail this ship from England down to, by the way, this is a little aside, I brought my globe today. If you guys are ever lucky enough to grow up and get married, people will give you a bunch of stuff like dishes, and one of your mom's friends will give you a salad bowl from Italy. But if you're lucky, one of your buddies will give you a globe, which is, I think, the most important piece of furniture to have in your house. And, it's awesome. But anyway, so they were going to get a ship from England, sail down North Atlantic Ocean, South Atlantic Ocean, reprovision in Argentina, head over to South Georgia Island, sail down to Antarctica, disembark with men and dogs and food, go across the continent. The ship would sail around, pick them up, and they'd be heroes. It's going to be awesome. More than 5,000 men applied for 27 slots. No money involved, constant danger, safe return doubtful. They filled the ship. And on January 1st, 1914, the day that Ernest Shackleton first announced this, let's think about this. This school was here. This chapel wasn't here, but boys were gathered in the chapel at Maine. The mountains over the Taconic Range were exactly the same. In Europe, a great ship was being built in Ireland called the Titanic. And things were starting to stir up in Europe, which would become World War I. No one called it that then. But Ernest had this dream of this expedition. And on August 1st, the ship called Endurance actually left London. And those of you who've been to England, you know, London's way up a river that to come down the Thames and around the corner and sail down out to the open ocean. So it takes like a week from get to London to the southwest corner of England, and the ship stopped a couple of times along the way. And when I got to Portsmouth by August 4th, the war was starting. And Ernest felt the need to contact the British government and say, I'm willing to give up the ship for the war effort if you need us. And the Prime Minister wrote back and said, proceed with your expedition. So they took off. 27 men, 69 dogs on the ship Endurance. After a few days at sea, they realized they actually had 28 men. A young man had actually stowed away to do this. So even the guys who were getting virtually no money, there was one who was willing to do it for nothing. But by then, they were 800 miles out to sea, they weren't going to turn back. And this young man went with them. That was in August. By October, they were in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to reprovision the ship. On October 26th of 1914, they headed further south to South Georgia Island, then a whaling station, their last stop before heading to the bottom of the world. By mid-December, the ship had sailed out of open ocean into what's called ice pack, where they had to stop often because the ship kept running into ice, and they had to pick their way south. On January 19th, they saw Antarctica, the continent itself. And they're only one day sail from terra firma, where they could put the dogs ashore and the men and start the expedition across the continent. And the ship became stuck hard in the ice January 19th. Stuck. And they couldn't go any further. And to push the fast forward button, they would be stuck there for the rest of that summer, for the rest of that fall, and then into an Antarctic winter aboard ship. No radio, no electricity, limited food, 28 men, 69 dogs on a ship in complete darkness. For 4 months of that time, no light. Remember in the fall with the October storm? And we lost power for, 27 and a half hours? And our whole world kind of fell apart. We were cold. I'm astounded by this story. This wooden ship stuck in the ice for almost a year. And by the way, this meant that the whole expedition was doomed. At this point, they knew at the best it would be a failure. The whole idea of crossing the continent, they knew was over. At this point, it was just, let's just hope we get out of this alive. We'll wait out the winter. Hopefully it'll cool. When it warms up in the spring, we'll head back north, go back to England with our tail between our legs. That didn't happen. On the night of October 26, 1915, the ship was making such terrible noises of the ice cracking in on it that by the following morning they had to abandon ship. Imagine this, 1915, bottom of the world, no radio, nobody knows exactly where you are, and you suddenly have to abandon ship, and all the men and all the dogs moving onto the ice. And within a couple of weeks later, as I set up this camp, kind of gathering what to do, Ernest told his men, the ship is gone. It hadn't sunk yet, but the ship is gone. We're out of food. It's time to go home. How are they going to go home? Then the ship sank, and the men watched in horror as their ship finally got eaten up by the ice and disappeared. What they had left were 3 lifeboats, 3 wooden lifeboats, which are literally the length of your pews, about as wide as 2 of the pews. They had 3 of those. And they set up camp with the provisions they'd taken off the ship, And their plan was, with the men and the dogs, to drag these boats across the ice, north, 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 until they could get to open ocean and then sail. By the way, the roughest patch of ocean on the planet. After a few days of trying to drag the boats, they realized it was futile. They could not do it. If you guys, you can Google pictures of this expedition, by the way, and you'll see that these ice packs, when they jump against each other, they form big throws that are 15, 20 feet high. It's not like a smooth lake of ice. It is bumpy, and they literally couldn't do it anymore. And they had to stop and break camp, and it was kind of this solemn moment of realizing, guys, we need to really pare it down. And Ernest, in front of his men, got his gold watch his grandfather had given him, threw it on the snow. All the money he had, including a bunch of gold coins, threw it on the snow, to say we need to lighten up and carry next to nothing. And really, we need to get north. This is life and death. Interestingly, the Queen of England had given them the Bible, which was the ship's Bible, which Ernest was fond of reading. But even that, he said, was too heavy for them to carry. So he pulled the front page out of it, which included a prayer from the Queen, which said, "May the Lord help you to do your duty and guide you through all the dangers by land and sea, and may you see the works of the Lord and all his wonders in the deep." He also pulled out Psalm 23, which is the psalm we just read. Our school psalm, by the way. A psalm of being hopeful in the midst of the greatest despair. He also ripped out the book of Job to keep in his pocket, which, to completely oversimplify an ancient story, is a story of undeserved human suffering. And he kept Paul's letter to the Hebrews. And what Ernest didn't know was that one of his men picked up the Bible and stuck it in his pocket and carried it anyway. He also, in spite of the fact that weight was important, there was a man on the crew who had a banjo. And he says, "You have to take that too. That's coming with us." There was also a man who was the ship's photographer who couldn't keep all the slides, but Ernest said, "You keep your camera." And every man who had a journal, he said, "You keep your journal." Because he knew these things were as important to their survival as food, their spirit and their optimism. And if you guys are lucky enough to read this story, I guarantee you'll feel like I did when I read it. If it were fiction, you'd say, "Give me a break." Because what these men went through the next year and a half is unbelievable. Eventually, the natural forces of the wind and waves pushed them farther enough north that the ice began to fall apart. In fact, one night they were camped out and the ice actually split where a tent was straddling it, and two men fell into the icy water to pull them out. When it became open enough, they got into the boats. And for a week, they sailed these 3 open boats with frostbite, cold and lonely at the bottom of the world, and they got to a place called Elephant Island, a non-inhabited, remote, freezing cold island, pretty much this long peninsula at the bottom of Antarctica. So for the first time in a year and a half, they set foot on dry land. And they were happy for a short amount of time, but they knew that winter was coming. They had little food. Nobody was going to come get them. And so Ernest and 4 of the guys decided to take one of the boats and sail it 800 miles across the roughest patch of ocean back to South Georgia Island, where there's a whaling station. That in itself is an amazing story. And they made it, leaving the rest of the crew on the island They made it to South Georgia, landed on the west side. By the time they got there, one of the men was so sick with frostbite that they had to cross the island, which has peaks of over 9,000 feet high, glaciers. They weren't all going to make it across the island. So Ernest and 3 others set out to cross South Georgia Island. These mountains out here are about 1,500 to 2,000 feet high. Those mountains are between 8,000 and 12,000 feet high. And they walked for 36 hours, 22 miles over glaciers, and wound up in this whaling station almost 2 years later. And it is said that when the first people saw them, they were terrified. They looked like ghosts, like monsters, and started weeping at the looks on their faces. They got a boat to head back to Antarctica to rescue the men, and were thwarted by ice and had to return. A month later, they got another ship to head south to try to rescue his men. And ice and storms prevented them from going any further. They say that the third time was the charm. They chartered the schooner Emma, a British schooner, sailed south to pick up the men at Elephant Island. They got within 100 miles and had to return because of storms and ice. 3 times. After all that, he couldn't get back to his men. Ultimately, on August 30th, 1916, on the 4th try, with a Chilean Navy ship, they got back to Elephant Island, and all the men were alive. All 28 men of the Endurance expedition survived. It's one of the greatest stories of leadership I think ever told. Business schools teach it, the military teaches it, theologians teach it. It is a story of the human spirit and how much it can do with hope and optimism and faith. When Shackleton wrote his memoirs, he credits his success to 3 or 4 things. First of all, he credits, in his own words, providence and God and faith. He says faith and optimism and patience and imagination made all the difference. And as he's saying in that final hike across South Georgia, when the 3 of them were walking across the glaciers to get help for their friend, and wanting to stop at every step and give up, his devotion to his men, taking care of his friends, and the deep sense that the 3 of them were not alone. He writes in very poignant language that somebody else was with him the whole time. My hope for all of us, whatever we do in life, is that we can remember in whatever situation we're in, especially the hard ones, to sustain hope and optimism and faith, to be patient when we can't do anything else, and to have the imagination to understand that we can get through more than we can imagine in the moment. Hope you guys have a good day.